250 years ago, 13 British colonies in North America declared their independence from the rule of George III. That document included the most famous line that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, perhaps one of the most consequential political claims of the modern era. The state, or collection of states, the Republic, which emerged from that declaration, became over time the most prosperous and powerful nation in the world, with global reach and presence to match. A true Leviathan. But the celebrations for the 250th anniversary have been somewhat muted and carried out with very obvious graft and corruption at the heart of the executive. The nation is deeply divided, and the very powerful but increasingly vandalized state being celebrated might look completely unrecognizable to those founding fathers. It's not only the sheer cynicism and political nihilism of the Republican Party, but the sense that some of the tensions in the American political self-conception between that declaration of equality and a defense of liberty have become perhaps impossible to square. At the same time, the political economic order which undergirded American global dominance is obviously faltering. And yet, no clear alternative seems to be able to emerge, whether that's Sanders-style socialism, outright white supremacist isolationism, or total corporate supremacy. Of course, these political questions are important in their own right, and the laboratory of American democracy, to steal a phrase from an American jurist, is instructive even for non-Americans. But it is especially significant to those of us in Britain, which has a close and complex relationship to the United States. More than just sharing a language, we are exposed to its political economic spasms, we're strongly influenced by its political culture and debates, and we lay our economy open to international arms of American companies. It's not to say that we're the same or that we're the 51st state, but that the transatlantic distance is often rather less than we think. What happens in America matters to us, whether we like it or not. And that, I think, has been particularly true over this past decade, where the Trump and Brexit phenomena kicked off at the same time, and both nations now bear down on enormously democratically consequential elections in 2028 and 2029. You're listening to On Politics on the LRB podcast. I'm James Butler, a contributing editor here at the London Review of Books. And joining me is the historian Gary Gerstle, a perceptive chronicler of the modern American political order, who has written extensively on just these questions and, having taught at Cambridge, the one in this country, for many years, someone who's eminently qualified to talk about both of those political cultures, Britain and the United States. Gary, welcome.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Maybe we should just start very briefly with those 250th celebrations. It's obviously very tempting, I think, for those covering American politics in the United States to point out how rather empty and pageant-like so much of the Trump presidency is. Is that reflective of the general mood? Has it been, rather muted, or are we just seeing the worst?
No, I think it has been rather muted, and I think it reflects a broad and deep decline in the confidence that many, many Americans of different political persuasions have in their democracy. I like to contrast this moment with the bicentennial of 1976, which I'm old enough to remember. And I was then a pretty deep critic of the American state and American society. I came in at the tail end of what was then called the New Left. And we were angry about many things in America: white supremacy, the war in Vietnam, repression of various groups defined by gender, poverty, race. But we had a determination in 1976 to reclaim the right kind of heritage for America and to insist that we would have a people's bicentennial, regardless of what Gerald Ford was doing in the White House and the official celebrations. We were going to do something different because there was a heritage there that was ours and that it was our duty to reclaim and deploy for the next 50 years. Nothing of that sort happened in 2026. You saw elements of it, and you may have heard of the No Kings marches across the last year. It's certainly very interesting that No Kings March was scheduled for July 4th. I think there's a general depression among progressives in the United States about the possibility of claiming that heritage for themselves. And I think Trump failed as well. Pageantry, of course, was going to be part of this, but the pageantry was empty, and the heat and thunder, it almost felt like a divine intervention declaring the American Republic to be yesterday's news. It was so hot in Washington that the state's fair exhibits had to be canceled. His own speech and fireworks had to be delayed for hours because of thunderstorms at night. It was almost as if the heavens were opening up to decree this is no longer a promised land or a providential land. And I also think, to bring the World Cup into this, that he understood that his celebration was a bust. And one of the reasons he wanted to emphasize his role in getting the suspension of the American striker lifted was to change the narrative. And he was successful in doing that. And so that no one is even thinking or talking about July 4th. And we're very happy to see it pass. The one point of inspiration that I take is that at the local level, in innumerable towns and cities, the parades and the flag waving and the very sweet local celebrations of neighbors flying the flag. I was a spectator at one of those. My son and his family, who live in rural New York, were spectators at another. There are still well springs of civic belief and civic renewal that are out there, so they are capable of being remobilized when circumstances permit. But these were local celebrations profoundly disconnected from what was going on in Washington. And so a very disillusioning moment overall, I would say.
Mm. And I guess it's a way into thinking about the political entity that has existed over those 250 years, because one of the things I was saying in that introduction is that some of the founding fathers might look at the current republic and say, well, this is quite a long way from what we envisioned and what we put together all those years ago. I think there's a reasonable question to be asked about whether really it's the same political entity that existed then, and where you put that break, I think is in some ways interesting. Whether you put it after the Civil War, whether you put it with the kind of agglomeration of powers that happens over the course of the 20th century, so a sort of strengthened federal government and the rise to political power of the Supreme Court. It's an important thing that happens, I guess, sort of 1960s. Is it excessive to say that there's more discontinuity than continuity there?
There have been two major changes in the history of the American Republic. One is something that you referred to, which is the rise of a powerful central state across the 20th century, which the founding fathers wanted to guard against. When the Republic was founded, the central government was meant to be strictly limited in size and power, and a lot of power was reserved for the individual states, where the people were thought to be closest to the levers of government and could have their most powerful expressions of popular sovereignty. Any powerful industrial state that has to engage in warfare in the 20th century cannot go into those situations with a weak and limited central state. So there was a central state built across the 20th century, very powerful, far more powerful than I think the founding fathers had imagined it should be, because their central goal was to make sure that a dictator of the sort that they thought George III was would never arise again on American soil. And that required various twists to a constitution that, for all intents and purposes, could not be significantly amended because the bar to amendments was so high. And so the large state arose in the context of an 18th century constitution, which generated opposition to the rise of a big state because it was seen in some ways as fundamentally unconstitutional. So there arose alongside this powerful state a deep antipathy to that central state, which has informed Republican Party politics especially powerfully since the 1960s. So that constitutes one very major change. The other change is the Trump change, because in the context of this strong central state arising, there was a sense, on the one hand, of checks and balances within that central state. The executive was gaining more power, meaning the presidency, but he was meant to be checked both by the courts and by Congress. And across the Trump era, which really begins in 2016, what we have seen is the Supreme Court no longer willing to check the power of the executive, the power of the presidency, and a sharp and very serious decline in the power of Congress. Certainly that has been one of the most stunning developments that I have witnessed over the last 10 years. Congress is the purest expression of the people's will. It's where the people are most amply represented. And so if Congress is going to go into decline, it means that the popular will, or the ability of the people to exercise their popular will, is also going to go into decline. And so we are seeing a second profound change, concentration of power in the executive, the stripping away of the people's will from Congress, that marks a change in the 21st century as profound as the rise of the central state was in the 20th century. Now, the founders would be surprised by all of this, but not entirely. They were very well versed in the ancients. They had a deep knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. They studied very carefully the history of republics. They were also very familiar with the experience of republicanism, small r republicanism, in the Italian city-states of the early modern period. And if you were to condense the history of republics to one line, it would be that they did not last very long. Liberty was a fragile flower, and republics that protected liberty were always in danger of descending into one form of dictatorship or another. Monarchy ruled by one man, aristocracy ruled by a few men, and democracy, which was a bad word in the 18th century, meant rule of the mob. So they might have marveled that this republic that they had set up in 1789 to 1791 had lasted more than 225 years, which to their minds would have broken all records for republics established across the known human history.
It is one of the most sort of startling facts of, I guess, ancient political theory and then 18th century political theory as well, is how aware everyone is of the sort of risk of degeneration of a virtuous state into a tyranny of one kind or another. And it's something that I think can be really astonishing for a modern to read, is that it seems incredibly pertinent to contemporary politics in a way that can perhaps be surprising. You mentioned the decline of Congress there, and I suppose it's, perhaps you can correct me. My knowledge of the American Constitution is not very deep, but my understanding is that the powers of the presidency are, formally thought to emerge from Congress and are limited to those that are enumerated, in the Constitution, and that their fount, in one sense, is Congress itself. So that's a really significant political change. Then, if Congress is essentially non-functional, decisions are essentially presidential, and then the court, which has acted, I suppose, over the course of the 20th century to increase the power of the executive, often in ways that one might find congenial. So, for instance, the Warren Court, the Liberal Court of the 1960s, uses quite a novel interpretation of parts of the Constitution, to push forward equality of various kinds. But this results in quite a powerful central state. So if that court is now no longer willing to do things other than essentially rubber stamp the executive, and what do we have other than a purely presidential system?
I think the United States right now has a powerful presidential system in which Congress is a sideshow. Doesn't matter in a serious way. Nothing has changed constitutionally to strip Congress of its power. It has part of what is mind-boggling about recent developments is that Congress has willingly sacrificed many of its powers. It's not as though the Supreme Court has hit hard at Congress, although a couple recent decisions strip certain congressional legislation of their attributes. But it's not as though Congress has thought to increase its power in recent years and has been rebuked by the courts. It is that it has willingly ceded its lawmaking power to the presidency. And what the Supreme Court has done is to, in this quite terrible decision of 2024, endowing the presidency with a kind of an immunity from almost any kind of surveillance or oversight that went far beyond what was necessary in order to protect individual presidents from retribution. It's not so much that they have stripped Congress of its powers, it's that they have enlarged the power of the presidency. Congress can still reclaim its powers if it finds the will to do so. And I think a couple factors explain the decline of Congress, which also, it's not just a national matter. I think it's an international matter and has to do with a general lack of confidence in other democratic systems of what legislatures can do. On the one hand, you have these extremely powerful corporations in America embodied in Silicon Valley and Elon Musk and Amazon and Google that are truly international. National legislatures are national legislatures, and they are set up to legislate and control what's in the nation. There is no international government that seems capable of managing these international corporations. So some of what is afflicting American Congress has to do with international corporate developments and developments in the realm of capitalism. And the world has not figured out how to get these extraordinarily powerful private corporations under control. The other elements have to do with America being in a perpetual state of war. The perpetual state of war began with World War II, legitimately so in the 1940s, and then it continued with the Cold War from 1946 to 1991. And then there was a brief respite where America tried to move off of a war footing, and that was destroyed by the attacks of 9/11. And the Patriot Act passed in the aftermath by Congress of 9/11. Many of its provisions are still in effect. And war everywhere empowers executives. It's necessary for the executive in time of war to have exceptional power in order to wage war. It should be still under the supervision of Congress. But if you think of how many years America has been on a full or partial war footing since 1941, it's been most of the last 75, 80 years, and that contributes to an executive that is constantly trying to aggrandize itself and its powers. And that has led to a shift in power from Congress to the executive. And that's a particular situation in the United States. And if the United States is to recover a more healthier democratic republic, it is going to have to find a way to leave the war footing on which it has been for so much of the last 80 years. The other element is a kind of partisanship and a division between Democrats and Republicans, so that almost every Congress is almost equally divided between Democrats and Republicans. And that has led to a kind of paralysis of the legislative will. To get any major legislation passed in Congress, I won't go into the details, you need a supermajority of 60 senators. And only once or so in the last 30 years has there been a majority of 60 senators for one party or another. Obama had that in 2008 and 2009. And if Congress is perpetually divided between two very hostile parties that don't want to work together, what are presidents to do if they want to address very real problems that the country is experiencing? And this began with Obama. Mitch McConnell, who's now teetering on the edge of life, was Senate minority and then majority leader of the Republican Party. He made it his cause to make sure that the Obama presidency would be a failed presidency. And so he set out to block every piece of legislation that Obama could possibly imagine coming up with. What does Obama do? He resorts increasingly to executive orders, which are presidential executive decrees, which leads to a kind of presidentialism. This continued under Biden, whose executive orders are extraordinary. And of course, Trump, when he came into office, I think he signed more than 20 executive orders on his first day in office. And since he thinks of himself as a king, and with a court, and really has no interest at all in the Constitution or preserving the constitutional heritage of America, he's perfectly pleased to bypass Congress. And so America has now, in an era of being governed by presidential decree, in which Congress is almost entirely beside the point.
It's interesting, this account of contemporary politics, because so a decade ago you published a book called Liberty and Coercion, which traces a tension, a really instructive and interesting tension in American politics between that suspicion of tyranny and the interest in, the use of law as a kind of moral regime, something called police power that emerges from kind of 18th century legal theory, where I think we tend to think of phrases like states' rights as being basically code for the ability to enact racist or segregationist regimes of one kind or another. But the way that you tell that story is about a kind of series of at least kind of capacities for kind of, moral political experiments of one kind or another, right? In these kind of disparate regimes, which are held together with a relatively thin state on top of it. It seems to me one way of reading the politics of the Republican Party is to say that, well, police power of that kind of moral legislature can be the function of the federal state. We think it should be. And we're going to eliminate, much hope of sort of any kind of variability of regime within the United States itself. And that there's not a very strong commitment to democracy there. So I guess my question is, do you still see that tension between the sort of local and federal, as it were, the state level and the federal level, as being constitutive of American politics as it still operates, or has that now been entirely subsumed into this, this politics of the executive?
Well, Trump wants to entirely subsume this politics into the politics of the executive. But the tension between the power of the states and the power of the central government is still alive. The Republican Party under Ronald Reagan wanted to strip the central government of many of its powers that were not military, and to insist that the moral regimes that many Americans want have to be legislated and fought over by political parties at the level of the states. So he was someone who was interested in respecting states' rights. And the Warren Court, which stands alone almost as a liberal Supreme Court in American history, it tried to break states' rights and the police power of the states, which was very, very extensive, in order to deliver on the promise of the amendments of the Civil War, those that ended slavery in America, and insisted that there could no longer be any discrimination on the basis of race. Most of the laws governing racial injustice, white supremacy in America were state laws in the United States. And the Warren Court, which was a very liberal court, felt that it had to take whatever measures it could to break the power in order that the 14th Amendment, and arguably after the first 10, the most important amendment in American history, would be honored, and that there would be no more racial discrimination in the United States. In order to do that, they had to read the Constitution in extremely expansive and creative and imaginative ways, which got the Republican Party understandably upset. The Warren Court nevertheless went through with it because they thought that black racial equality was a more important good for the United States than respect for states' rights. And so the Republican Party became the repository for states' rights in the 1970s and 1980s. And if there was going to be a moral regime enacted in America, it was going to be done in the states. Trump has no regard for any other power center other than his own. He has no respect for the rights of states, but he has not constitutionally eliminate where the power of the states lies, which is still in the Constitution of the United States. And I would argue that the most effective resistance to Trump has come and is still coming and is going to come from individual progressive states that begin to tell the central state and the highly militarized and repressive state that Trump is establishing that what they want to do in America violates the rights of states and violates the rights of majorities of states, and that the federal government is simply not allowed to do this. So what we're seeing now is a historic shift in the meaning of states' rights. 50, 100 years ago, it meant the right of states to discriminate against blacks and establish white supremacy. The Warren Court ended that. Now the rights of states are about resisting the concentration of power in the executive and restoring the rights of the American people by empowering particular states. And we're seeing states like California, Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, leading the struggle, Pennsylvania, I would say as well, leading the struggle against Trump efforts to concentrate power in the executive. This is, in American terms, called the struggle over federalism, which is the proper division between the states and the central government. And I do think that the Supreme Court will be reluctant to, if there are conflicts between the states and the central government that go to court, I think the Supreme Court will be reluctant to undermine the power of the states, which means this old police power, which is actually an inheritance from the 18th century British doctrine of the police, comes from the Crown, sort of jumped over the Revolution and got encoded into state constitutions. This tradition lives on and is going to be one of the foundations on which progressive resistance in the future to Trump is built.
And so one of the questions there is about the Supreme Court and what it does and how it acts. I think one of the ways of looking at American politics over the last few decades has been in this kind of quite intense, juridical struggle over the meaning of the Constitution. The name for that tends to be given the name originalism, which is the idea that if it's not there in the Constitution, then it's not a matter that can be relevant to lawmaking. The history of the Supreme Court is an interesting one for the account that you give of American power, because it's an institution that has evolved over the course of the Republic. One of the reasons it has the power it does is because of some quite canny positioning by Supreme Court justices of various kinds. It's also been subject to kind of political change over the years. And one of the strong arguments that is now made by thinkers on the left and on the progressive side of American politics are that, I'm thinking of someone here like Samuel Moyn. They argue that the power of the court needs to be curbed, that it is simply too strong within American politics. And what that looks like is an open question. Like, do you pack the court in one kind or another? Do you try and do something else? But is American politics inevitably juridicalized? Is it hard to escape that kind of juridical format of political conflict, right? Where so these political conflicts are displaced into legal conflicts about what's permissible in the context of American democracy? Is that just an inevitable feature of the Republic as it stands, or is there something that's gone wrong?
The answer to your question is both of the above. I think the juridical character of the American Republic became part of the blueprint in the early years of the Republic in the early 1800s and will remain so for a long time to come. And that stems from the United States having the oldest written, continuously enforced constitution in the history of the world, which from one perspective is a great achievement, right? It's the United States that's still living under a constitution that it approved in the 18th century. From many perspectives, it's a remarkable achievement. But it's also a great burden, because how can a document written in the late 18th century begin to address all the questions of a late 20th and early 21st century advanced industrial society, reckoning with all kinds of issues and problems that no founder could have anticipated? And I would say the biggest weakness of this Constitution is that the bar to amendment is extraordinarily high. There have been 26 or 27 amendments to this Constitution in all of American history. And if you strip away the first 10 amendments, which is really part of the Constitution ratification process of the early 1790s, if you strip away another 3 amendments from the Civil War era, which became possible because the states that would have opposed those amendments had been kicked out of the Union because they had gone to fight against the Union. if you take out the stupid prohibition on alcohol amendment of the early 20th century, which then triggered a Second Amendment to repeal the stupid amendment 14 years later, if you strip out all those exceptional elements, you're left with about 10 amendments that were not enacted in these exceptional moments. 10 amendments over, 230 years, this is not a supple document. And that has required Congress as a legislative body to legislate in imaginative and creative ways to make sure that it was in consonance with an 18th century Constitution. And in order for that to stand, it has required the intervention of the court again and again to read the Constitution imaginatively. Because if the Constitution was read rigidly, most of the legislation of the 20th century would have been thrown out. And so I think having a constitution that can't be changed and that is the governing law of the land requires a Supreme Court with exceptional powers and exceptional flexibility. So I think getting rid of that institution is not going to happen, not in my lifetime and probably not in yours either. In other words, it's got to be with the United States for a long period of time. But there have been moments when the behavior of the Supreme Court has become so extreme and so out of standing with popular opinion and so politicized that steps had to be taken to correct it. And Sam Moyn is right. The Supreme Court is in need of correction, and Congress has the powers to reform the Supreme Court through a variety of mechanisms. The 9 justices, that's not written in the original Constitution. That's a number that can be changed. The Congress can impose term limits of 15 or 20 years or less on Supreme Court justices. The Congress can also legislate that certain pieces of legislation will not be subject to judicial review. So this again brings us back to Congress and the importance of Congress in the American constitutional system. It has powers to corral the power of the Supreme Court, and hopefully it will find the will to do that in the near future. But in order to do that, one party, probably the Democratic Party, has to have sufficient majority in Congress so as to enact its will. And as long as Congress remains weak and divided and incapable of fulfilling its legislative responsibilities, we are going to continue to see the increasing power of the court and the rule in the United States by a president on the one hand and the least democratic institution of the federal government, meaning the court itself, because none of them are elected, on the other. So I would take this back to the weakness of Congress as being the central development in the American governing system, the central weakness that is profoundly threatening to democracy in America. And unless and until Congress seizes its power back, which it can do, the trends we have seen will continue to intensify.
Let's see if we can get under that weakness a bit, because one of the questions I think it's really hard to answer. I don't think there's necessarily an obvious explanation or it's easy to read across. But your most recent book charts the sort of decline of the neoliberal political order. The United States' global presence, its kind of status as a kind of global power, and in some ways the global power, has extended across two what you call political orders, right? The New Deal order and the neoliberal order. I think it's striking, and I think you make a pretty persuasive case that the neoliberal order is, if not coming to an end, then transforming in such a way that it would be unrecognizable to those at the start of it. And one of the ways that that's the case is that it is less able to command the consent of the governed than it used to, right? The parts of political order that people take for granted, right? So this is, the things that even people who have opposed neoliberalism have absorbed from it. Things like, the utility of a global market, or the kind of cosmopolitan political order that I grew up in, for instance, in the 1990s, the assumption that, that the cosmopolitanism of various kinds is always a necessary good. those things have receded a bit. What's striking is that nothing really has emerged yet to take its place. You have figures who are coming from political margins, right? So figures of the American political left, Bernie Sanders, the kind of new wave of sort of DSA-aligned leftists, sort of less kind of explicitly socialist progressives. These are people who are very much shut out of democratic politics for a very long time. They're very marginal figures. At the same time, Donald Trump was a sort of rather ludicrous figure in lots of ways until I think he still is a ludicrous figure in lots of ways, but until he sort of I suppose in some senses channeled that resentment that was there in the sort of Tea Party era into a kind of new form. But these are people who are coming from, I think, in some ways recognizably American political traditions. On the left, the tradition of sort of Debs and that kind of American socialism that of that sort of early 20th century kind. And then in Trump, perhaps the sort of know-nothingism, the sort of strange, paranoid history of the American right. So is it the case that that's where the kind of new formation will come from, that it will have to be articulated from within American political history? Or is there some kind of blockage here that is preventing a kind of new political formation arising?
Once again, both of the above. I think we can see two very different political orders struggling to be born. And just to underline part of what you said about how political orders work, for political orders to work in my telling, one party has to have a program that becomes so popular at the polls and so convincing in terms of its description of the good life that the opposition party feels compelled to come aboard and participate in this hegemony, so that Republicans got on board with the New Deal under Eisenhower in the 1950s, and Democrats under Bill Clinton got on board with Reagan-era free markets, globalization in the 1990s. And that moment of the opposition party acceding to the wishes and program of the dominant party has not happened in America. For reasons we've been discussing, the deep partisan divide. Both Roosevelt and Reagan, in terms of establishing their political orders, had these overwhelming electoral victories. In Roosevelt in 1936 and Reagan in 1984, each of them got over 60% of the popular vote and over 90% of the electoral college. Those numbers are unimaginable in American politics today. That's the kind of election you need to compel the opposition to get on board. There was a very serious progressive political order that was center-left. It was the Biden-Sanders alliance. And in the book I'm writing now, I'm trying to recover the Biden presidency from the dustbin of history into which it has been consigned. Their program of political economy, of breaking with globalization, free markets, privileging private corporations in all ways, insisting that there be redistribution of wealth, the use of a strong state to regulate capitalism and the economy in the public interest. The initiatives unveiled under Biden during his term were the most significant in American history since Roosevelt and the New Deal. And what you're seeing in the success of local socialists and local progressives in American politics, Mamdani being the best example of this, is the continuation of that. Socialism is not going to triumph in America. You heard it here, in case any of your listeners are wondering. But when the Democratic Party has been really successful, it has been through a center-left coalition. And Biden-Sanders demonstrated how that could be done. The mystery, and I think it's bound up with the COVID years, is why this very promising program of political economy was repudiated by the American people, and why a figure who you described as ludicrous, and I would agree, but the problem is he's a very serious and consequential ludicrous figure who has reshaped American politics as much as any single individual since, I would say, Roosevelt himself. There is a plan among his supporters for a different kind of political order that shares some elements of the progressive political order, a hostility to the privileges of private corporations, a hostility to AI, a hostility to free trade, a desire to weight international trade so that the ordinary people of America are not the losers in this struggle. There is a populist sentiment on both sides of the political aisles that these two programs are trying to enact. The story of Trump, however, is that he has no interest in widening his popular base. He has a very different conception of political order. He does not want to make his position so popular that the opposition party feels compelled to come over to his side for the sake of electability. That's not happening. He's trying to achieve his political order not through consensus or hegemony, but through coercion. And here we see the demonstrations of coercion in a remarkable number of ways in the deployment of heavy militarized forces in all kinds of American cities. This embodies a key value of the Trump administration. And the guiding light in this is no one in America. It's Viktor Orban in Hungary, who established his political order through coercion, through force, through changing the constitution, through rigging elections, through weaponizing the courts so that all decisions would go in favor of the party in power. The connections between MAGA and Trump on the one hand and Orban on the other are very, very close. Constant stream of visitors up to and including J.D. Vance going over to Hungary to meet with Orban and his supporters, conservative organizations meeting in Hungary. So they have in mind a political order that succeeds not by convincing a large majority of the American people that this is the future for them, but through coercion, seizing the powers of the state, of the military, of government, of judiciary to enforce a certain kind of hierarchy and a certain kind of political system, and ultimately a certain kind of dictatorship on the American people. That's the alternative. That has not yet succeeded. If elections are fair and free in 2026, Trump and his supporters will be repudiated. But of course, there's a big question as to whether those elections will be fair and free. And it is a sign of their determination never to be ousted from power. I think Trump understands himself that if elections are fair and free, he will suffer big losses in the upcoming elections. So he's doing everything in his power to make those elections unfair and unfree, which, if he is successful, will inter American democracy in America. But right now, neither has succeeded, and we're still living in an extended and very volatile interregnum.
Yeah, I thought it was. I've been reading the new J.D. Vance memoir, which is really, at least in its second half, essentially a manifesto for a kind of religious integralism of some kind. It doesn't use that name, and it doesn't quite say that the Catholic Church should be dictating the scope of life in America, which would activate some deep taboos in American culture. But it's like it's some pretty spooky stuff. My question from what you've been saying though is about the Democrats. So I understand why, at the end of a kind of political order that has privileged corporate power and capital of various kinds, that the Republicans might find themselves, inclining towards an anti-democratic politics of one kind or another. But what's striking to me is how difficult the Democrats have found it to permit renewal within their own party. So sometimes this is explained as a kind of gerontocracy within the party, saying that, there's just a generation of people who won't get out of the way for the sort of newer, younger, exciting people. For various reasons, I don't think that quite adds up. There are many sort of young democratic political operatives who are committed to a sort of rather watery and sort of reactionary articulation of progressive politics. But does it not strike you as somewhat strange that the Democrats seem to have real trouble adjusting to the end of neoliberalism?
Yes. And here it comes back to the question of why the program that Sanders put forward. And it should be said that Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez were the last significant political figures to abandon Biden in that depressing summer of 2024, where his dementia became so pronounced, it became impossible to ignore. they developed a program of political economy with potential for wide appeal, and it failed miserably. And I think one of the things the Democrats have to sort out is the relationship of their economic program to their cultural program. And one of the elements that is a burden on the Democrats is that while their economic program breaks with neoliberalism profoundly, their cultural program, which is deeply steeped in cosmopolitan values, you described yourself as having grown up in a cosmopolitan world. I have lived and flourished in a cosmopolitan world that has ending. The progressives and the left valorized deeply the cosmopolitan world that neoliberalism facilitated. This was a world of capitalist triumph on the one hand, but it was also a world in which privileged the free movement of people. It privileged the richness that would come from different cultures encountering each other and producing syntheses and variety that many of us came to value deeply, that allowed for different kinds of gender and sexual roles to flourish. In other words, and I assume you are on the progressive left in some form, or that's where you reside. Part of what the neoliberal world created and facilitated is something we deeply value. We see this in the difficulty we have coming up with an immigration policy that is going to be seen as broadly popular. Why? Because we value immigration. We value what newcomers bring into the society and the kind of cultural pastiche and dynamism that results from that. And this is the most difficult issue for the center-left of political parties to develop an immigration policy that remains true to our cosmopolitan instincts on the one hand, but that respects the interest of majority of voters on the other to restrict the arrival of newcomers into the society. So part of what the Democrats have suffered deeply from, and this is not just the Democrats in the U.S., this is Labor in the U.K. and social democratic parties and socialist parties in Europe as well, is the unwillingness, completely understandably, to put a brake on their cosmopolitanism for the sake of getting the electoral majorities they need to win power. I think an electoral majority is achievable on political economic grounds, on regulating capitalism in the public interest. But that requires coalitions with people who see us as the last manifestation of a neoliberal world that has to be eliminated. And it thus becomes incumbent upon us to convince those skeptical voters that our interest in immigrants, our interest in diversity, our valorization of cosmopolitanism is not going to perpetuate the neoliberalism that has done them so much harm under a new guise. And they see us as elite figures, the LRB as an elite institution, the universities in which I teach as elite institutions. Cosmopolitan is fine in these circumstances, but they don't work for societies as a whole. And I would say that the weakness of the Democrats lie precisely at that point. And there have been various initiatives and theories that the young will take over the world. I've been around long enough I was the original youth generation that was going to take over the world, the baby boomers, okay? I don't think you'll agree that we have taken over the world, but not in what you might call a progressive direction. But this dream of youth triumphing over old recurs again and again. It was there with Corbyn, right? And when he ran for office. And actually, the demographics are against the young, because I did a little demographic analysis of the United States of two cohorts of people defined by age. In 2016, the number of 16 to 29-year-olds relative to the number of people over 65 was 1-to-1. 100 years earlier, the ratio of 16 to 29-year-olds to people over 65 was 3-to-1. That's a profound difference.
Yeah.
And it means that in order for the left to succeed, it's probably going to have to figure out ways of making its cultural agenda palatable to older groups who vote in very large numbers and are not dying anytime soon. What we need is a kind of coalitional strategy in order to push forward at the economic program to the point where it has a chance of success. And that is where I would locate the Democrats' most serious problem. There are signs that they are learning. I think the Mamdani campaign in New York was very clever about pushing economic issues about affordability to the fore. No one doubts his cultural credentials, but they were not at the forefront of his campaign. They do not explain the success he had in New York City. So there are some indications that a learning is going on and that there are, in fact, hopes for the future.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question that is kind of based on your transatlantic experience, really. And it comes from, it was inspired by, I was reading a passage in Alistair MacIntyre, who's one of, very interesting philosopher, who sort of makes the argument that, left-wing anti-Americanism, whatever its virtues have been at various points, it is often animated by a kind of, a rather anxious sense that the United States, in one form or another, represents, the completion or the execution of a political project that European polities were not able to bring to fruition themselves, right? So this is the sort of Republican turn of the late 18th century, and its aftermath. It is, however, also true that, in the 20th century, American political forms have now influenced our politics very, very profoundly. So in institutional terms in Britain, we have a Supreme Court. It's not the same as an American Supreme Court, but it is very doubtlessly influenced by it. Our military is kind of deeply integrated with that of the United States. Ideologically, I think, American positions on things like speech rights, for instance, have a way of finding their way into British politics. I think lots of the arguments we have in this country are strongly influenced by American positions on freedom of speech. Economically, of course, firms like Palantir or the kind of big tech firms are finding, ways into our economies. International treaties, of course, bind us to the United States in all sorts of interesting ways. Now, this is, in some senses, just a feature of, American global hegemony, right? Like, it's inevitable that that's going to be the consequence of a global power. But I wonder whether there's an argument to be made that there is a sort of shared political culture here, that there is some sort of, whether it's one-way or two-way transatlantic exchange. And given the rather difficult state the United States finds itself in, its increased kind of unreliability as a sort of international actor. So one of the features of the J.D. Vance book, for instance, is that he makes the argument that the American military is overextended. Now, whether you buy that or not is a different question, but that's clearly the argument he wants to make. So my question then for you is, let's say you're incoming British Prime Minister Andy Burnham, right? You're in one sense stuck with an American alliance of some kind. The United States is not going to disappear. But how do you start to think about that relationship? How do you start to think about managing it in a world where, certainly for the foreseeable, the American presidency is quite unreliable?
How is Britain to manage this relationship, given the unreliability of the United States? With difficulty. I think there are affinities between Britain and America. Start with the language. Common law tradition. The 13 colonies, they were founded at different times, but some of them were part of a British world for 150, 175 years. That's a long period of time. And the common law, even as the U.S. went in a different way with having a written constitution as opposed to an unwritten constitution, the common law has played a very important part in American jurisprudence throughout American history. And that owes a lot, obviously, to British common law. And then I think the so-called special relationship was real, but it was time limited. It did not exist in the early 19th century when Britain and America went to war again in the War of 1812. Relations were very tense through the Civil War years when Britain wanted that cotton from the Confederate States and was inclined to side with the Confederacy. What seals what we think of as the affinity or the special relationship is the World War II alliance and then the Cold War alliance. And I do think part of what sustained that is a conception of liberty which is identifiably Anglo-American and different from the continental interpretation of liberty. It's very interesting in this regard, and I've thought a lot about this when writing my book on neoliberalism. But why is it that Britain and America become the two most important intellectual cockpits of neoliberal thought in the late 20th century? Not that the ideas originate there necessarily. They originate in the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they migrate pretty quickly to London and then University of Chicago and other places in the United States. And you think of the affinity of the close resemblance of the rise of politics in the United States during the years of the special relationship. The Democratic Party dominates when Labour Party politics dominate in the UK. Thatcher and Reagan and the neoliberal revolution happened almost at exactly the same moment. Blair and Clinton are joined at the hip in terms of facilitating bringing labor and the Democratic Party on board with the neoliberal revolution. And then, unbelievably, Brexit and Trump happened at exactly the same moment in 2016, almost uncanny. And the close resemblance of the trajectory of politics in those two countries over that period of time suggests the strength of that affinity, which is rooted in history, shared culture, shared language. There are also, however, differences between the two countries, profound differences. Race has mattered in America in ways that class has mattered in the UK. The absence of an landed aristocracy in the US has made a world of difference to its politics. And also coming out of the experience of revolution and separating itself from Britain, that framed itself as a strong central government in the guise of George III being the greatest threat of tyranny to Americans' liberty. And from that moment on, there has been a hostility to the central state in America, stronger than anything that exists in the UK, where the attitude toward the state much more clearly resembles the continent than the United States. So there are differences as well as similarities, but certainly worthy of an article on the nature of Anglo-American liberty, similarities and differences that one day actually I hope to write. What this means for the UK at this moment, I think the fundamental principle right now is that America is simply unworthy as an ally, and that the UK should do what Canada is doing, instrumental in its relations with the United States, understanding that they are you take what you can get, but that it is not a reliable ally. And even if a Democratic president were to be elected with a Democratic Congress in 2028, Britain, as the Europeans and the Canadians and members of NATO are asking, what does this mean for the longer term? And so I think it would be an hubristic act on my part to give Britain advice about what to do. So, but I do think forging an independent place for itself in the world is absolutely critical to its future. And here I think what underlay the hope of Brexit is being exposed. I think there was a hope among the Tories that the special relationship with the United States and an incredible trade deal with the United States would more than replace whatever was being lost in terms of connection to Europe. And I do think that the Britain is not a big enough economy. There were also visions of becoming a Singapore of the North Atlantic. I don't think that's happening. I mean, the city of London is the only element of Britain to come out blossoming like a rose. So it will survive and it will continue to do what it does, but neither a close alliance with the United States that's not going to save Britain, and the Singapore model is not going to save Britain. And so I think its future lies in a much closer alliance, either formal and informal, with Europe, getting access to that market and becoming using Britain's obvious resources, talents, experiences, wisdom, institutions, to build the European Union in a way that bends it toward Britain's will and principles. My advice or my suggestion, advice is, I don't want to give advice. My suggestion would be that the future of Britain lies much more in Europe. And Europe as a democratic entity, I would say, is critical to the future of the world and in terms of the new world order that's emerging. And Britain has to be deeply part of that conversation, whether that leads to a formal reknitting or a series of informal connections. That is where I think Britain's best future lies.
Last very, very brief question for you. You mentioned, of course, the midterms this year and the elections coming up in 2028. What for you would be signs for optimism ahead of those two really significant elections?
Well, pretty obvious. The Democrats taking one or both houses of Congress in 2026 and taking both houses of Congress and electing a Democratic president in 2028. And dare I hope for a majority large enough, so larger than what Biden had, to make it to restore Congress to the legislative institution that it is meant to be. I do think democracy is irrepressible, so that I think if America loses its democracy, it will have to learn from other nations that have struggled to get their democracy back. And there's some good examples of that, whether it's Germany or Spain or Chile or Brazil or Argentina. There are now hopeful examples of countries having lost their democracy and having succeeded or on the way to success in terms of getting them back. So I do believe that there are, despite to bring us back to the beginning, the lack of no King's marches on July 4th, the lack of a massive progressive demonstration to reclaim the rightful inheritance of the Declaration and the Constitution, despite the absence of that, there are an awful lot of Americans like me who take those founding documents very seriously and as the essence of what America has been and is meant to be. And I will also say that, and I emphasize this when I talk to young audiences and young listeners, in my book on the rise and fall of the neoliberal order, I also do a brief history of the rise and fall of the New Deal order. And I treat the New Deal order that emerged suddenly and powerfully out of the catastrophe of the Great Depression. But that's not quite true. If I ask when did the struggle for the New Deal order begin, a progressive political order that had the will and the ability and the legislation and the support to regulate capitalism in the public interest of America. That's what stood at its core. If I ask when did that begin, it did not begin in the 1930s. It did not begin in the 1920s. It began in the 1890s with the farmers' populist movement. It gathered strength and then failed across the progressive years in World War I. It appeared to be defeated in the 1920s by a very powerful Republican surge, and Roosevelt had great hopes for his future in American politics, and he goes to the 1924 Democratic Party convention and finds it utterly divided and helpless and hopeless and incapable of doing anything. And 8 years later, out of this moment of hopelessness, comes his victory in the beginnings of the New Deal order. If I boil that down, this progressive political order took 40 years to build. If we date the emergence of a new progressive political order in America, if we follow that on a similar timeline, let's begin it with Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street. Let's begin with Occupy Wall Street 2011. We're 15 years into what is probably a 40-year project. And so it's very important for progressives to gear themselves for the long march. And long march is Mao's long march. I'm not imagining a communist long march. What I mean by a long march is being willing to not get discouraged by serious defeats and having the resilience and the resourcefulness to bounce back. And the best example of that are the neoliberal theorists and intellectuals themselves. No one cared at all who Milton Friedman was in the 1950s, or Friedrich Hayek, or Ludwig von Mises. No one gave a fig for any of them, but they kept to their beliefs. They continued to develop their policies when they were in the wilderness. They believed that they would one day be delivered to the promised land, and they wanted to be ready for it. And after 30 years of being in the wilderness, they got their chance, and they were ready. And my message is the same to those who want to build a progressive political order in the United States. Build, 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 and the future will one day belong to you.
That's a great place for us to leave it. Gary Gerstle, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
A real pleasure. A rare optimistic note to end it on there. And of course, if you've enjoyed listening to this discussion, you will enjoy reading the London Review of Books. Our latest issue is out now, and it includes David Runciman on American gerontocracy, Peter Gagan and Lucas Armin on Palantir, Barbara Newman on medieval self-help, Ray Monk on Einstein, and much, much more besides. Thanks for listening.